A wild horse surrounded by bets and humiliations challenges the most experienced. But it is in the silence of a forgotten girl that the impossible begins to happen. The sun rose relentlessly over Good Hope Ranch, transforming the extensive pastures into a golden sea that stretched as far as the eye could see. In the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, that rural property was more than just a simple ranch. It was a kingdom where Howard Vance had reigned supreme for more than 2 decades. At 55, Howard was an imposing man with broad shoulders and a penetrating gaze that intimidated anyone who dared to contradict him. His fortune, built through livestock businesses and shrewd investments, was known throughout the state. But it wasn't just money that defined him. It was pride, cultivated as if it were more precious than his fertile lands. "Mr. Vance, you need to see this," said Charlie, his foreman, approaching the veranda of the main house where the rancher was having his morning coffee. The man had a tablet in his hands, displaying local news on the screen. "What is it now, Charlie?" Howard asked, without raising his eyes from the printed newspaper he preferred to read every morning. "It's about the horse boss. The bet you made is spreading on social media. Look at how many people are commenting." Howard finally looked up, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. Storm. His most recent and expensive investment had become the sensation of the region. The black horse of pure lineage, acquired for an astronomical sum at an auction in the capital, was truly a work of art from nature. Defined muscles, coat shining like polished ebony, and eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. $50,000 to anyone who can ride him for 3 minutes, murmured Howard, savoring each word. A fortune for most of these people, but just pocket change for me. The problem was that Storm wasn't just beautiful, he was untamable. Since arriving at the ranch 3 months ago, not a single trainer had managed to even approach the animal without being violently thrown off. His explosive temperament justified his name. He neighed like thunder echoing across the fields, ran with the speed of lightning cutting through the sky, and threw off anyone who tried to control him. "How many have tried this week?" asked Howard, standing up and walking to the balustrade of the veranda. 12, boss. The last one was that guy from Deep Creek. Didn't even get close. Storm saw him from afar and started kicking right away." Howard laughed loudly, a sound that echoed through the quiet morning. "Perfect. Each failed attempt increases my reputation. Soon everyone will know that Howard Vance owns the only truly untamable horse in Virginia." Down below, near the stables, one could hear Storm's furious neighs. The animal was isolated in a special enclosure, built with reinforced wood and fences, higher than normal. Even so, from time to time, the sound of hooves beating against the boards could be heard, as if the horse were trying to escape from an invisible prison. "Boss, there's one more thing," Charlie hesitated before continuing. "The workers are saying that the beast isn't normal. They say there's something strange about him." "Strange how?" Howard frowned. "I can't explain it well. They say he gets very agitated when he hears loud noises. Yesterday, when that truck with the broken horn passed on the road, Storm almost knocked down the fence." Howard dismissed the comment with a wave of his hand. "Nonsense from simple people. He's a purebred horse with the blood of champions. Of course he has a strong temperament." But deep down, a small doubt was beginning to form in his mind. In recent days, he had noticed strange behaviors in the animal. Storm seemed to react not only to human presence, but to specific sounds. Engines, shouts, even the noise of tools falling to the ground made him panic. "Organize another show for the weekend," Howard ordered. "Call those people from the local radio to do a live broadcast. I want half the state to know about my bet." "Yes, sir." As Charlie walked away, Howard remained on the veranda, observing his lands. Each acre there represented power, influence, respect. He had built an empire based on determination, and mainly on the ability to never show weakness. Storm was just another piece in this game, a symbol of his supremacy over everything and everyone. Later, during lunch served in the dining room of the main house, Howard received a visit from some political friends from the region. Representative Andrew Parker, a state representative and old business partner, was among them. "Howard, my friend, this story about the horse is taking on interesting proportions," commented Andrew, cutting a piece of steak. "It's already reached the newspapers in the capital." Great. Free publicity, Howard replied, serving himself more wine. But are you sure no one will be able to ride the beast? $50,000 is no joke. Howard smiled confidently. I'm absolutely certain. The best trainers in the region have already come. All failed miserably. Ripon Parker nodded, but there was a thoughtful expression on his face. Just be careful not to underestimate the determination of simple people. Sometimes they can surprise. Has? These words echoed in Howard's mind for the rest of the afternoon. As he walked around the ranch inspecting the workers' activities, he wondered if there was something he wasn't seeing. Storm continued to be a mystery, a puzzle that his wealth and influence couldn't solve. At dusk, when the sun began to set behind the mountains, Howard headed to the stable where Storm was confined. The horse was restless, walking from one side to the other within the enclosure. When he noticed the rancher's presence, he stopped and stared at him fixedly. For a moment, man and animal measured each other in silence. Howard felt something different in that gaze. It wasn't just anger or fear, but something deeper, as if the horse held secrets that no one had bothered to discover. Tomorrow more people are coming to try to ride you, murmured Howard. And you'll continue to be my untamable trophy. Storm neighed softly, almost as if he understood the words, and resumed his nervous walk around the enclosure. Howard walked away, satisfied with his certainty, without imagining that very soon his confidence would be tested in a way he could never have predicted. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. Saturday morning dawned with unusual activity at Good Hope Ranch. Cars and pickup trucks had been arriving since early, bringing curious people from various neighboring towns. The news of Howard's bet had spread like wildfire, and what had begun as a personal demonstration of power was turning into a true regional event. Old Joe Williams, the elderly blacksmith from the nearby village, was among those present. At 70, with white hair and hands calloused from a lifetime of work, he observed the movement with a thoughtful expression. Unlike the other spectators, who came in search of entertainment, Joseph felt a growing uneasiness in his chest. This isn't going to end well, he murmured to himself, adjusting his straw hat as he walked toward the enclosure where Storm was. The horse was more agitated than usual. The presence of so many people, the noise of arriving cars, and the animated voices of the crowd seemed to put him in a state of maximum alert. His nostrils dilated nervously, and he stamped his hooves against the ground in an accelerated rhythm. Ladies and gentlemen, Howard's voice echoed across the yard, amplified by a megaphone that Charlie had provided. Welcome to Good Hope Ranch. Today you will witness another attempt to tame the untamable Storm. The crowd applauded and crowded around the enclosure. Howard, wearing his best white linen shirt and a genuine leather hat, was in his element. Each admiring look, each comment about his property and his daring, fed his ego like fuel on a fire. The first candidate of the day was Henry Johnson, an experienced ranch hand from a farm in 7 Lakes, tall and muscular, with more than 15 years of experience with horses. He approached the enclosure with confidence. He carried a rope and wore reinforced riding boots. This one looks promising, commented Ripon Parker, who had arrived minutes earlier, accompanied by other local politicians. Howard smiled. We'll see. They all looked promising so far, Henry entered the enclosure with calculated movements. Storm immediately positioned himself on the opposite side, looking fixedly at the man. For a few seconds there was a tense silence. Then, when Henry took the first step toward the horse, Storm exploded in fury. He leaped forward, neighing loudly, and charged at the ranch hand. Henry managed to dodge by a hair's breadth, but when he tried to approach again, he was knocked down by a well-aimed kick to the leg. The crowd shouted. Henry limped out of the enclosure, supported by 2 helpers. Another failed attempt. $50,000 are still here, shouted Howard, displaying an envelope full of money. Who else wants to try? 3 other candidates presented themselves throughout the morning. A young rodeo cowboy, a retired horse trainer who had returned to active duty especially for that occasion, and even a woman experienced in equestrian. All failed spectacularly. Storm seemed to get more aggressive with each attempt, as if each failure of the candidates increased his determination to remain untamed. It was almost noon when something unexpected happened. A small figure appeared at the entrance to the ranch, walking slowly along the dirt road that led to the main yard. It was a girl appearing no more than 12 years old, wearing simple clothes, a faded blue cotton skirt and a white blouse that had seen better days. She carried a small cloth bag and walked with a strange serenity, as if she didn't notice all the commotion around her. "Who is that child?" someone in the crowd asked. The girl approached the group of spectators, and it was then that some noticed something peculiar. She didn't react to the sounds around her. When a car honked on the road, she didn't turn her head. When someone shouted her name trying to get her attention, she continued walking as if nothing had happened. Sarah Miller, a traditional shopkeeper from the village who had come to witness the spectacle, was the first to realize. "Folks, this girl is deaf," she said in a low voice to the people beside her. The observation spread like a whisper through the crowd. Everyone began to look at the girl with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She seemed oblivious to all the attention, focused only on something that only she could see. It was then that old Joe noticed the note hanging around the girl's neck. He approached her carefully and managed to read the words written in simple block letters. "I want to try." "My God," murmured the blacksmith. "She wants to try riding the horse." The information quickly reached Charlie's ears, who immediately brought the news to Howard. The rancher was talking with some important guests when his foreman approached, with an expression between amused and embarrassed. "Boss, there's a situation here that you need to resolve." "What situation?" "It's a girl. She wants to try riding." "Storm?" Howard frowned. "A girl? How old?" "About 12, more or less. And there's one more thing. She's deaf, boss." The silence that followed was broken by Howard's loud laughter. He laughed so much that he needed to lean on Rep Parker to keep his balance. "A deaf girl? Charlie, are you joking with me?" "No." "Sir, she's over there with a note saying she wants to try." Howard wiped the tears from his eyes and looked in the direction Charlie was pointing. There she was, small and fragile in the midst of that crowd of adults, with a serene expression that completely contrasted with the chaos around her. "This is ridiculous," said Howard, but there was something in his voice that didn't convince, even himself. "She's just a child." "And deaf," added Representative Parker. "Howard, you can't let a girl with a disability risk herself with that animal. It would be irresponsible." But the crowd had already noticed the girl's presence and had begun to comment. Some said it was absurd, others showed genuine curiosity. There was something in the girl's posture that awakened contradictory feelings. She seemed simultaneously vulnerable and determined, fragile and brave. "What's her name?" Howard asked Charlie. "Nobody knows, boss. She doesn't speak. She just has that note." Howard approached the girl, followed by several curious onlookers. When he got close enough, he could see her eyes for the first time. They were brown, large and expressive, with a depth that surprised him. She looked at him, directly, without fear or submission, only with quiet curiosity. "What's your name?" asked Howard, momentarily forgetting that she couldn't hear him. The girl didn't answer, obviously, but pointed to herself and then to the enclosure where Storm was. Her message was clear. She wanted to try. The situation was becoming awkward for Howard. Denying a deaf girl's attempt could seem cruel in the eyes of those present, but allowing it could be even worse if something happened to her. He found himself in a dilemma that his wealth and influence couldn't easily resolve. It was then that old Joe approached and gently touched the girl's shoulder to get her attention. When she looked at him, he made some simple gestures with his hands. To everyone's surprise, she responded in the same way. "You know sign language?" asked Sarah, impressed. "A little," replied Joseph. "My granddaughter is a teacher and taught me some things. Her name is Lucy." The name echoed through the crowd like a revelation. Lucy, simple, delicate, but carrying a strange strength that no one there could explain. The girl remained serene amid all the commotion, her brown eyes fixed on the enclosure where Storm continued his nervous dance. "Lucy," repeated Howard, testing the name on his tongue. "And she really wants to try riding my horse." Old Joe conversed with the girl again through gestures. Her hands moved with a natural grace as if she were painting words in the air. When she finished, the old blacksmith turned to Howard with a solemn expression. "She says she didn't come here for the money. She says the horse is suffering and she can help." The response took everyone by surprise. Murmurs spread through the crowd. How could a deaf girl know if a horse was suffering? And more importantly, how did she intend to help where experienced trainers had failed? "Suffering?" Reppers Parker laughed nervously. "What does a child understand about horses?" Howard felt pressured by the expectant looks around him. Part of him wanted to dismiss this ridiculous situation immediately, but another part, a small voice that he rarely listened to, whispered that there was something special about this girl. Besides, the presence of the local press and so many important guests made it difficult to refuse in a way that could be interpreted as cowardice. "All right," he finally said, surprising even himself, "but with one condition. If something happens, to her I'm not responsible, and she doesn't need to stay mounted for 3 minutes. If she can just touch the horse without being thrown off, it will already be a miracle." The crowd stirred. Some protested, saying it was too dangerous. Others showed genuine curiosity about what might happen. Charlie tried once more to dissuade his boss, but Howard had already made his decision. "Prepare the enclosure," he ordered, "but keep the paramedics on standby." While the preparations were being made, Lucy remained motionless, observing Storm. The horse also seemed to have noticed her presence in a different way. He didn't show the same agitation he had demonstrated with the other candidates. Instead, he observed her with cautious curiosity, as if trying to decipher something new and inexplicable. Sarah approached old Joe. "Joseph, do you really think we should let this happen? If something goes wrong?" "Sarah," replied the blacksmith in a low voice, "I've worked with animals for more than 50 years. I've never seen a horse look at someone the way that beast. Just looking at the girl. There's something happening here that we don't understand." Lucy slowly made her way to the entrance of the enclosure. She carried no ropes, whips, or any riding equipment. Her hands were empty, and she moved with a tranquility that contrasted drastically with the growing tension of the crowd. "She doesn't even have protective equipment," someone murmured. "This is madness," said another. Howard observed everything, with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. Part of him wanted the girl to fail quickly, confirming his superiority and ending this embarrassing episode. But another part, one he was reluctant to admit, secretly hoped that something extraordinary would happen. The gate of the enclosure opened with a metallic creak. Lucy entered without hesitation, her bare feet touching the packed earth with softness. Storm, who was on the opposite side of the enclosure, immediately stopped moving. His muscles tensed, his ears rose, but he didn't show the immediate aggression he had shown with all the others. The crowd fell silent. Even the children stopped crying and talking. It was as if everyone instinctively knew that they were witnessing something different, something that required silence and respect. Lucy didn't try to approach the horse. Instead, she did something no one expected. She sat on the ground in the center of the enclosure and became completely still. Her legs crossed, hands resting lightly on her knees, eyes closed as if she were meditating. "What is she doing?" someone in the crowd whispered. "Why isn't she trying to ride the horse?" one asked another. Minutes passed, 5, 10, 15. Lucy remained seated like a statue, while Storm observed her with an attention that no one had seen in the animal before. Slowly, very slowly, the horse began to move. Not with the explosive violence of before, but with cautious, almost reverent steps. Howard felt a tightness in his chest. Something was happening there, something that defied all his understanding. About control and dominance. The horse that had thrown experienced trainers in a matter of seconds was approaching a defenseless girl with surprising gentleness. Storm came within a few meters of Lucy and stopped, his nostrils dilated, inhaling the air around him. There was no fear in his eyes, nor the anger that everyone had learned to associate with the animal. There was only curiosity and perhaps, although it was hard to believe, a kind of recognition. "My God," murmured old Joe. "Look at the beast's eyes." He's calm. It was true. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Storm seemed truly at peace. His breathing had normalized, his muscles relaxed, and he observed Lucy with an almost human attention. Suddenly, a strident sound cut through the silence. One of the parked cars had started, and the defective horn began to sound uncontrollably. The effect on Storm was instantaneous and devastating. The horse jumped backward as if struck by lightning, his eyes widened in terror, and he began to neigh desperately. The crowd stirred, fearing that the fragile peace that had been established would be broken forever. But Lucy didn't move. She remained seated, motionless, as if the noise didn't exist for her, which, obviously, it didn't. And then something happened that no one would ever forget. Storm, still trembling with fear from the sound of the horn, looked at Lucy and seemed to remember her silent presence. Gradually, his tremors decreased, his neighs transformed into low sighs, and slowly he returned to approach the girl. "Turn off that horn," shouted Howard, but his voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. He was witnessing something that defied everything he believed about power and control. When the noise finally ceased, Storm had positioned himself very close to Lucy, so close that she could touch him simply by extending her hand. But she didn't. She continued sitting, offering only her silent presence. The horse slowly lowered his head until his muzzle almost touched the girl's hair. They remained like this for long minutes, two creatures who had found something rare in the world, mutual understanding without words. When Lucy finally stood up, she did so with the same serenity with which she had sat down. She didn't try to. Storm didn't try to touch him. She simply headed to the gate of the enclosure and exited, walking with the same tranquility as always. The crowd exploded in confused murmurs. Some applauded, others remained silent, trying to process what they had just seen. Howard remained motionless, his $50,000 still in the envelope, but feeling as if something much more valuable had just escaped from his hands. She didn't even try to ride the horse," said Repes Parker, breaking the silence. "No," replied old Joe, his eyes still fixed on Lucy, who was walking calmly toward the exit of the ranch. "She did something much more difficult. She communicated with him." The sun was already beginning to set when old Joe caught up with Lucy on the dusty road that led to the village. The girl walked with the same calm pace as always, as if what had happened at the ranch was just another common episode in her life. Lucy called the blacksmith, but soon remembered that she couldn't hear him. He quickened his pace until he caught up with her and gently touched her shoulder. When she turned, Joseph saw something in her eyes that touched him deeply. It wasn't sadness or joy, but a kind of serene understanding, as if she knew secrets that the world wasn't yet ready to understand. Through simple gestures, he asked where she lived, where she was going. The answer left him even more intrigued. She had nowhere to go. She had arrived at the village that morning, coming from who knows where, carrying only her small cloth bag and an inexplicable determination to find the horse everyone was talking about. "You can't stay on the street," said Joseph, forgetting again about her hearing limitation. Then, with more elaborate gestures than he knew how to make, he tried to communicate his concern. Lucy smiled for the first time since she had arrived, a small but genuine smile that illuminated her young face. She made some signs with her hands, which Joseph interpreted as gratitude, and nodded positively when he pointed in the direction of his workshop. Old Joe's workshop was on the main street of the village, an old building of exposed brick where he had worked for almost 40 years. Next to it, there was a small room that he used as storage, and that now could serve as temporary shelter for the girl. "It's not much," he said, opening the door to the simple room that contained only a single bed, a small table, and a wooden chair. "But it's clean and safe." Lucy explored the space with her eyes, touched the bed and the table gently, and smiled again. Her gestures expressed a gratitude that dispensed with words. That night, while Lucy rested peacefully in the small room next to the workshop, Joseph stayed awake for hours, thinking about what he had witnessed at the ranch. In his 50 years, working with horses, horseshoes, and rural equipment, he had never seen anything like it. The way Storm had reacted to the girl's presence defied everything he knew about animal behavior. The next day, Lucy woke up early and, without anyone asking, began to help in the workshop. She organized tools, swept the floor, and even tried to help with some simple tasks. Her dedication and care impressed Joseph, who began to wonder what kind of life this girl had had before appearing at his door. But it was on Sunday afternoon that something extraordinary happened. Lucy was helping Joseph organize some materials when she suddenly stopped, as if she had heard something. Obviously, this was impossible, but she went to the window and looked in the direction of the ranch with an expression of concern. "What is it?" asked Joseph, approaching her. Lucy pointed in the direction of Good Hope Ranch and made gestures that he interpreted as a question about the horse. There was something in her posture that suggested urgency, as if she knew that Storm needed her. "You want to go back there?" Joseph asked through signs. The response was a firm nod of the head. Joseph hesitated. Howard had made it clear that he considered the previous day's episode as a passing fancy, and that he didn't want any more clowning around on his property. But there was something in Lucy's determination that convinced him. "All right," he said, "but this time I'm going with you." They arrived at the ranch in the late afternoon. The movement from the previous day had completely disappeared, leaving the place with its usual tranquility. Joseph went to look for Charlie to ask for permission for Lucy to visit Storm, while she headed directly to the enclosure. The horse was visibly agitated. He walked from side to side, neighing softly from time to time, as if looking for something he had lost. When he saw Lucy approaching, he immediately stopped and went to the fence closest to her. "I don't believe it," murmured Charlie, who had arrived with Joseph. "The beast really recognizes her." Lucy sat outside the fence, in the same position she had assumed the day before. Storm positioned himself inside as close as possible to her, separated only by the wooden boards. They remained like this for more than an hour, in a silent communion that no one could explain. It was during this vigil that Charlie, impressed with what he was seeing, decided to tell Joseph something that had been bothering him for weeks. "Mr. Williams, can I tell you something? But it's a secret." "Of course, son." "This horse, I think he suffered something bad before coming here. The boss bought him from a certain Colonel Ted Harrison from Greenville. They say the man wasn't too kind with animals." Joseph frowned. "What kind of thing?" "I don't know exactly, but since Storm arrived here, any loud noise makes him desperate. Car horns, shouting, even the sound of a hammer hitting. It seems like he panics." The information made Joseph reflect on the animal's behavior. Acoustic trauma. He had seen this in mistreated horses, subjected to violent methods of training that used fear and pain as tools of control. "And does the boss know this?" he asked. "I think he suspects but doesn't want to admit it. He spent a fortune on the beast and doesn't want to accept that he might have bought a horse with a problem." At that moment, as if feeling that he was being observed, Storm raised his head and looked directly at Joseph. There was something in his eyes that the blacksmith immediately recognized, the unmistakable mark of suffering. It wasn't just wildness or strong temperament, it was fear, it was pain. It was the memory of experiences that no animal should have to endure. "Charlie," said Joseph in a low voice, "do you know if there are still documents from the purchase of the horse? Papers that show exactly where he came from?" "There must be everything filed in the boss's office. Why?" "Just curiosity." But Joseph knew it was much more than curiosity. There was a suspicion growing in his mind, a theory that could explain not only Storm's behavior, but also the inexplicable connection between the horse and Lucy. When the sun had completely set, Lucy got up and said goodbye to Storm with a gesture of her hand. The horse watched her leave with an expression that Joseph swore was sadness. It was as if he knew he would have to wait until the next meeting to feel again that peace that only the girl's silent presence could provide him. On the Keene, way back to the village, Joseph made a decision. He needed to discover the truth about Storm's past, and he had the feeling that this truth could change much more than just the fate of a traumatized horse. That night, while Lucy slept peacefully in the small room next to the workshop, Joseph stayed awake planning his investigation. Something told him that the next few days would bring revelations that no one was prepared to face. And in his mind echoed a disturbing question. Was it a coincidence that a deaf girl appeared exactly when a horse traumatized by noises most needed someone who lived in silence? If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. The routine of Lucy and old Joe established itself quickly over the following week. Every morning, the girl helped in the workshop with a silent dedication that touched the heart of the old blacksmith. Every afternoon, they walked to Good Hope Ranch, where Lucy spent hours in silent communion with Storm. Howard had initially protested against these daily visits, but the growing pressure from the local community made him reconsider. The story of the deaf girl and the untamable horse had spread beyond the borders of the village, reaching newspapers in larger cities. Reporters began to appear, asking for interviews and photos. For a man who loved being the center of attention, denying access to the girl could seem like unnecessary cruelty. Besides, there was something that Howard was reluctant to admit. Since Lucy had begun her daily visits, Storm was visibly calmer. The horse still showed aggression toward other people, but the episodes of panic had decreased considerably. It was as if the girl's regular presence brought a stability that no traditional method had managed to achieve. On Thursday of that week, Sarah Miller arrived at Joseph's workshop with an expression of barely contained excitement. She carried a shopping bag and seemed anxious to share a discovery. "Joseph, you need to see something," she said, looking around to make sure there was no one else nearby. "What is it, Sarah? You remember I mentioned I was going to clean the old stable at the ranch? The one that's been abandoned for years behind the main stables?" Joseph nodded. Sarah occasionally did cleaning work for Howard, especially during event times or when there were important visitors. "Well, I found something that really disturbed me." She opened the bag and took out a bundle of yellowed and partially torn papers. They were hidden under a pile of old wood, inside a wet folder. Joseph took the documents carefully. They were veterinary records, purchase notes, and what appeared to be handwritten notes. As he read, his expression became increasingly somber. "Good Lord," he murmured. "These are records from Colonel Harrison, and they're not normal records." The papers documented training methods that bordered on cruelty. There were detailed descriptions of techniques that used loud noises, metal objects banging near the animals, and even small explosions to break the resistance of the horses. One of the documents specifically mentioned a black horse of rebellious temperament that had been subjected to intensive sessions of these methods. "Joseph, there's more," said Sarah, taking another paper from the bag. "This one is a veterinary report. It talks about acoustic trauma in horses and the long-term effects of these methods. The report was signed by a veterinarian from Greenville and dated 6 months before Howard's purchase of Storm. It described a specific case of a horse that had developed a severe phobia of noises after being subjected to inadequate braking methods. The animal was described as black of pure lineage, with evident signs of psychological trauma." "This explains everything," said Joseph, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. "The poor animal was psychologically tortured, and now Howard uses this as entertainment." "There's one more thing," said Sarah hesitantly. "There's a paper here that mentions, well, maybe it's a coincidence, but—" She handed Joseph a handwritten note, apparently hastily scribbled. It said, "The method is working with most animals, but this specific one continues to resist. Perhaps a different approach is needed. Silence seems to calm him more than anything else." Joseph reread the note several times. "Sarah, do you think that it's not a coincidence that a deaf girl appears exactly when this horse most needs silence? Joseph, I don't believe in coincidences like that." At that moment, Lucy appeared at the door of the workshop. She had gone to fetch water from the well and carried a heavy bucket with surprising ease for her age. When she saw the papers in Joseph's hands, she stopped and observed them with unusual attention. "Can she read?" asked Sarah. "I don't know," replied Joseph. "I never asked." Lucy approached and pointed to the documents. Her eyes fixed specifically on one of the photographs attached to the papers, a grainy image that showed a black horse being subjected to one of the methods described in the report. Her reaction was immediate and intense. Her hands began to tremble. Her eyes filled with tears, and she made desperate gestures that neither Joseph nor Sarah could fully interpret. But the emotional message was clear. She recognized something in those images. "My God," whispered Sarah. "She knows something about this." Joseph knelt in front of Lucy and tried to calm her with gentle gestures. When she finally calmed down, he pointed to the photograph and then in the direction of the ranch, trying to ask if she knew the horse in the image. Lucy's response was a slow and sad nod of the head. Yes, she knew. Somehow she knew what had happened to Storm before he arrived at Good Hope Ranch. "Joseph," said Sarah in a low voice, "we need to tell someone about this. We can't let them continue treating this animal as a spectacle when we know he's a victim." "But tell who? Howard won't want to hear it. He spent a fortune on this horse and transformed the situation into a matter of personal pride." It was then that Sarah had an idea. What if we told that ex-sergeant Tony? He has contacts in the city, knows people in the press, and he's always been against the abuses of the powerful around here. Anthony. Tony Silver was a respected man in the village, an ex-military who had retired in the region and who frequently spoke out against local injustices. He had a strong personality and wasn't easily intimidated by political or economic influence. "It's a good idea," agreed Joseph. "But first we need to be sure of what we're talking about. These documents are serious. If we're going to accuse Howard of keeping a traumatized animal as entertainment, we need solid proof." That afternoon, when they went to the ranch for Lucy's daily visit to Storm, Joseph observed the horse with new eyes. Each nervous movement, each reaction to noises, each look of distrust gained a new meaning in light of the discoveries they had made. While Lucy sat in her usual position beside the enclosure, Joseph noticed something he hadn't realized before. Storm didn't just calm down in the girl's presence. He seemed to find in her a kind of refuge. As if after so much suffering caused by noises and violence, the absolute silence that she represented was the only thing in the world that still made sense to him. "Charlie," called Joseph when the foreman passed nearby. "Yes, Mr. Williams? Do you know if the boss has all the papers from the purchase of Storm well organized? Veterinary documents, history of the animal, those things. He must have everything in his office. Why do you ask?" "Old man's curiosity. I was thinking about the history of this horse, where he came from." Charlie looked around before answering. "Between us, Mr. Williams, I think the boss suspects there's something wrong with Storm's history. The other day I saw him looking at the papers with a worried face. But you know him. He'll never admit he might have made a bad deal." Joseph nodded, but his mind was already working on a plan. If Howard didn't want to voluntarily recognize the situation, perhaps it was necessary to force him to do so. And the documents that Sarah had found could be exactly the key they needed. When the sun began to set and Lucy said goodbye to Storm, Joseph made a decision that would change the course of the entire situation. It was time to look for Tony Silver and show him the evidence they had discovered. The battle for justice was about to begin, and this time the silence of a deaf girl could be the most powerful voice of all. Tony Silver's house was in the highest part of the village, from where one could see both Good Hope Ranch and the mountain range in the background. It was a simple but well-maintained construction, with a porch where the ex-sergeant used to spend the afternoons reading newspapers and observing the movement of the community. When Joseph, Sarah, and Lucy climbed the steep hill that Friday night, they found Tony watering his plants. Tall and thin, with graying hair cut in military style and an erect posture even at 60, he possessed the kind of presence that inspired confidence and respect. "Joseph, Sarah," he greeted, putting the watering can aside. "And this must be the famous girl who's messing with Howard Vance's pride." Lucy timidly waved to Tony, who smiled at her with a gentleness that softened his serious features. "Tony, we need to talk to you about something very serious," said Joseph, showing the folder with the documents they had found. "Come in, let's talk properly." In Tony's simple but cozy living room, the three adults settled around a solid wooden table, while Lucy sat in a nearby armchair, observing everything with her usual silent attention. Joseph and Sarah told everything, from Lucy's first appearance at the ranch to the discovery of the documents in the abandoned stable. Tony listened in silence, making occasional notes in an old notebook, his expression becoming increasingly serious as the story unfolded. "Let me see these papers," he finally said. Tony examined each document with the meticulous care of someone who had spent years analyzing military reports. When he finished, he closed the folder and remained silent for long minutes, clearly processing the implications of what he had just read. "This is very serious," he finally said. "If these documents are authentic, and everything indicates they are, we're talking about systematic animal abuse. And Howard, by using this traumatized horse as entertainment, is perpetuating the suffering." "What can we do?" asked Sarah. "First, we need to verify the authenticity of these documents. I have a cousin in Greenville who can investigate this Colonel Harrison. Second, we need to document the current behavior of the horse, prove that the symptoms of trauma are still present." Tony stood up and went to a shelf, from which he retrieved an old but well-preserved photographic camera. "Let's start recording. Everything. The girl's visits, the horse's reactions, any evidence that might be useful." It was at this moment that Lucy got up from her armchair and approached the table. She made some gestures with her hands, pointing to herself and then to the documents. "What is she trying to say?" asked Tony. Joseph tried to interpret. "I think she wants to tell us something. Something about herself." Lucy took a pencil and a sheet of paper from the table and began to draw. Her hands moved with surprising precision, creating images that gradually revealed a story. First, she drew a small house. Then, a tall man with an angry expression. Next, several horses in an enclosure. "She was there," whispered Sarah. "She saw what happened to the horses." The next drawing showed horses being subjected to situations that clearly terrified them. Noises represented by dotted lines, objects being thrown, expressions of fear on the animals' faces. The last drawing was the most touching. It showed a small girl hiding behind a tree, observing everything with tears in her eyes. "My God," murmured Tony, "she was a witness. She probably lived in the region where this Colonel Harrison mistreated the horses." Lucy made some more gestures, pointing to her ears and shaking her head negatively. Then she pointed to the drawing of the hidden girl. "She's saying she couldn't hear, but she could see," interpreted Joseph, "and what she saw traumatized her so much that she ran away." The revelation completely changed the context of the situation. Lucy wasn't just a deaf girl who had appeared coincidentally. She was a survivor, someone who had witnessed the same traumas that Storm had suffered. Her connection with the horse wasn't mystical or inexplicable. It was the mutual recognition between two victims. "This changes everything," said Tony, his voice loaded with emotion. "Now we're not just talking about a mistreated horse. We're talking about a child who fled from a situation of violence and found in Howard's ranch the same animal she saw being tortured." "What do we do now?" asked Sarah. "Now we fight," replied Tony with determination. "First, I'll contact my cousin to verify the facts about this Colonel Harrison. Second, I'll look for a lawyer who can help us. And third, we'll mobilize the community." "Mobilize how?" "Joseph, you know everyone in this region. Sarah, you have contacts in various towns. Let's spread the true story, not the spectacular version that Howard wants to tell, but the real story of a brave girl who is trying to help a traumatized animal." In the following days, the village transformed into a center of feverish activity. Tony fulfilled his word and managed to confirm the suspicions about Colonel Harrison. The man had been prosecuted in Greenville for animal abuse, but had moved to a remote region before the process could be concluded. Joseph used his network of contacts to spread the story among blacksmiths, veterinarians, and breeders in the region. Sarah talked with merchants and people who passed through her store. Gradually, the narrative began to change. What had begun as the bet of the rich rancher was transforming into the deaf girl's fight to save the tortured horse. Reporters who had initially come in search of a curious story began to discover a much deeper and touching plot. Howard, of course, didn't remain indifferent to this change in narrative. On the following Wednesday, he appeared at Joseph's workshop with a furious expression. "Joseph, what's this story they're spreading about me and my horse?" he demanded to know. "What story, Howard?" "Don't play dumb. They're saying I keep a mistreated animal as entertainment. That's slander." Joseph faced him with serenity. "Is it slander to speak the truth? You know where this horse came from, Howard. You know what happened to him before he arrived at your ranch. I bought a horse. I paid good money for him. What the previous owner did or didn't do is not my problem. It is your problem when you use the animal's trauma to amuse yourself and impress others. The discussion was interrupted by Lucy's arrival, who was returning from her daily visit to Storm. When she saw Howard, her expression immediately changed. It wasn't fear but a deep sadness, as if she saw in him something that deeply disappointed her. Howard looked at the girl and, for a moment, seemed to hesitate. There was something in her look that bothered him, an innocence that made him question his own actions. "Listen well," he finally said, recovering his authoritarian posture. "I won't allow you to transform my property into a circus. From tomorrow on, this girl doesn't enter my ranch anymore. And if you continue spreading lies about me, I'll sue all of you for slander and defamation." After Howard left, Joseph, Lucy, and Tony, who had arrived minutes later, looked at each other gravely. The situation had escalated to a direct confrontation, and now there was no turning back. "He's afraid," said Tony. "Men like Howard only make threats when they feel cornered." "But what now?" asked Joseph. "If he doesn't let Lucy see Storm anymore?" Tony smiled for the first time in days, but it was a determined smile, not a happy one. "Then we'll use the law. My cousin recommended a lawyer in Richmond who works with cases of animal rights and protection of minors. If Howard wants a legal fight, we'll give him a legal fight." The lawyer, Paul Henry Morgan, arrived in the village on a cold Monday morning, driving a simple but well-maintained car. He was a man in his 40s, of medium height and thin-rimmed glasses, who had worked for more than 15 years with cases of animal rights and protection of minors. His reputation for not being intimidated by political or economic pressures had made him a legend in his field. The meeting took place at Tony's house with the presence of Joseph, Sarah, and Lucy. Paul carefully examined all the documents, asked detailed questions about Storm's behavior, and mainly talked at length with Lucy through a sign language interpreter he had brought with him. "The case is solid," he finally announced. "We have documentary evidence of mistreatment in the animal's past, visual testimony from the girl, and current behavior that proves psychological trauma. I'll file a lawsuit questioning the conditions of maintenance of the horse and requesting that he be removed from the spectacle situation." "And what about Howard's threats?" asked Sarah. "Leave it to me. Men like him make a lot of noise but usually back down when facing organized opposition." Howard, however, didn't back down. On the following Tuesday, he appeared at Tony's house, accompanied by 2 lawyers from Richmond and a judicial summons. He was suing Joseph, Tony, and Sarah for slander, defamation, and trespassing. Besides, he had obtained a preliminary injunction preventing Lucy from approaching his ranch. "You thought you could intimidate me," said Howard, his voice loaded with contained anger. "Now you'll discover who you're messing with." Tony received the summons calmly. "Howard, you're making a mistake. The truth always comes out sooner or later." "Truth?" Howard laughed with disdain. "The truth is that I own that horse. I paid for him, and nobody has the right to question what I do with my property." "Even when that property is a traumatized living being," retorted Paul Henry, who had arrived minutes earlier. Howard turned to the lawyer with an expression of contempt. "And who are you?" "Paul Henry Morgan, lawyer specializing in animal rights. And I have bad news for you, sir. I've just filed a lawsuit contesting the custody of the horse." The tension in the air was palpable. The 2 groups of lawyers faced each other like gladiators before a battle, while the villagers observed that confrontation that would define the future of Storm and Lucy. "You have no idea where you've gotten yourselves into," said Howard, his voice low but loaded with threat. "I have political influence, connections, resources. I'll destroy all of you." It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. Representative Andrew Parker, the state representative and Howard's old ally, arrived at the scene in his official car. Everyone was surprised by his presence, especially Howard, who had not been informed of the visit. "Andrew, what are you doing here?" asked Howard. "I came to resolve this situation before it gets out of control," replied Reppers Parker, but his expression was serious, not friendly, as Howard expected. "Good. Now you can explain to these people that—" "Howard," interrupted Rep. Parker, "we need to talk in private." The two moved away a few meters and a heated discussion began in a low voice. No one could hear exactly what they were saying, but it was evident that it wasn't a friendly conversation. Rep. Parker gestured vigorously, while Howard became increasingly pale. When they returned, Howard's expression had completely changed. The arrogance had given way to visible concern. "Rep. Parker," said Paul Henry, "do you have something to tell us about this case?" The representative hesitated for a moment, looking alternately at Howard and at those present. Finally, he took a folded document from the inside pocket of his suit. "I have here something that can change the course of this discussion," he said. "It's a copy of a document that Howard asked me to witness a few months ago when he made the public bet about the horse." "Andrew, don't," began Howard, but was interrupted. "No, Howard, it's time to do the right thing." Rep. Parker turned to Paul Henry. "This document officially recognizes the validity of the bet made by Howard. Any person who managed to establish a genuine connection with the horse would have the right to question his custody." "That's impossible," said one of Howard's lawyers. "No bet can override property rights." "It can when it's made before witnesses and with notarized signature," retorted Paul Henry, examining the document, "and when it involves issues of animal welfare." Howard seemed to be in a state of shock. "Andrew, you're betraying me, after years of friendship." "It's not betrayal, Howard. It's conscience. I saw what that girl did with the horse. I saw how she managed to calm him when no one else could. And after we investigated the history of the animal," Rep. Parker shook his head, "you knew from the beginning that you were exploiting the suffering of a traumatized creature." "I didn't." "Know anything?" exploded Howard. "I bought a horse, paid the asking price, end of story." "Lie," said a weak but clear voice. Everyone turned in surprise. It was Charlie, the ranch foreman, who had arrived without anyone noticing. His expression was loaded with guilt and determination. "Boss, I can't keep quiet anymore," he said. "You did know. When the horse arrived, a letter came with it from the previous owner explaining the animal's behavioral problems. Remember? You read the letter in front of me and said that this only made the challenge more interesting." The silence that followed was deafening. Howard looked at Charlie with an expression of absolute betrayal, but couldn't deny his employee's words. "Where is this letter?" asked Paul Henry. "In the office at the ranch, kept with the other purchase documents." It was at this moment that a familiar sound cut through the air, Storm's desperate neighing. Everyone looked in the direction of the ranch, where they could see unusual movement in the stables. "What's happening?" asked Tony. Charlie turned pale. "Today is stable cleaning day. The workers use high-pressure hoses, metal buckets. The noise makes Storm desperate." As if confirming his words, another agonized neigh echoed across the distance, followed by the sound of hooves violently beating against wood. "He's going to hurt himself," said Joseph. Without hesitating, Lucy began to run in the direction of the ranch. Tony and the others followed her, leaving Howard and his lawyers behind. When they reached the stables, they found a devastating scene. Storm was in total panic, running desperately inside the enclosure, foam coming from his mouth, eyes wide. With terror, two workers were trying to control him with ropes, which only made the situation worse. "Stop!" shouted Tony. "You're making him more desperate." Lucy didn't wait for permissions or explanations. She opened the gate of the enclosure and entered, ignoring the workers' shouts of protest. Storm, seeing her, immediately stopped running, but he was still trembling violently. The girl positioned herself in the center of the enclosure and slowly sat in her usual position. The effect was gradual but visible. The horse's breathing began to normalize. The tremors decreased and he began to approach her with hesitant steps. When Howard arrived at the stables, followed by his lawyers and Rep. Parker, he found a scene that left him speechless. Lucy was sitting calmly, and Storm had lain down beside her with his head resting near her shoulder. Peace had returned, contrasting drastically with the chaos of minutes before. "My God," murmured Rep. Parker. "How is this possible?" Paul Henry turned to Howard. "Still have doubts about who really understands and can care for this animal?" Howard looked at the scene before him. The fragile girl and the powerful horse united in a harmony that defied all logic, and for the first time in weeks, he seemed to really see what everyone else had perceived from the beginning. He began, but his voice failed. For the first time in his adult life, Howard Vance had no words to defend himself. Judge Herman Ortega arrived in the village 3 days after the confrontation in the stables. He was a middle-aged man, known throughout the region for his impartiality and resistance to political pressures. He had requested an extraordinary hearing at the actual location of the facts, something unusual, but which he considered necessary given the complexity of the case. The hearing was scheduled for Friday afternoon in the main yard of Good Hope Ranch. A temporary structure had been set up with tables, chairs, and a sound system, transforming the space into an open-air court. Curious people from various neighboring towns gathered to witness what was already being called the trial of the century in the region. Howard arrived accompanied by his 3 lawyers, wearing his best suit and trying to maintain a confident posture that couldn't hide his growing nervousness. On the other side, Paul Henry represented the interests of Lucy and animal protection, supported by Tony, Joseph, Sarah, and dozens of local residents. Lucy was seated in the first row, with Joseph at her side serving as a sign language translator. Her serenity contrasted with the general tension, as if she knew that regardless of the legal outcome, something important had already been achieved. Judge Ortega initiated the hearing by examining all the documents presented by the 2 parties. The papers found by Sarah, the documents signed by Reverend Parker, the veterinary records, and the photos that Tony had taken over the weeks. "Before we proceed with the testimonies," said the judge, "I would like to personally observe the interaction between the minor and the animal in question." Everyone headed to the enclosure where Storm was. The horse, who had become visibly agitated with the presence of so many people and the noise of the sound system, calmed down immediately when he saw Lucy approaching. The judge observed in silence while the girl repeated her usual ritual, sitting down calmly, allowing Storm to approach by his own will and establishing that silent communion that no one could completely explain. "Extraordinary," murmured the judge to himself. Back at the improvised court, the testimonies began. Charlie was the first to speak, confirming that Howard had received information about the horse's trauma at the time of purchase. Reverend Parker explained the circumstances of the document he had signed. Sarah told about the discovery of the papers in the abandoned stable. When it was Joseph's turn, he surprised everyone by asking permission to present additional evidence. "Your Honor, I would like to call a witness who can clarify fundamental aspects of this case." "Who is the witness?" asked the judge. "Lucy herself through sign language." A murmur ran through the crowd. No one expected that the girl could or would want to testify. Lucy stood up with the same serenity as always and positioned herself before the judge. Through the sign language interpreter that Paul Henry had brought, she began to tell her story. The account was devastating in its simplicity. Lucy had lived on a farm near Colonel Harrison's property. Her family worked in the region, and she frequently witnessed the brutal methods used to break the resistance of the horses. As she couldn't hear the sounds that terrified the animals, she concentrated on observing their expressions, their movements, their body language. "I knew when they were afraid," translated the interpreter, conveying Lucy's words. "I knew when they were suffering, and I couldn't do anything to help them." The most impressive revelation came next. Lucy had recognized Storm from the first moment because he had been one of the horses she had seen being tortured on Colonel Harrison's properties. For months she had observed his suffering, powerless to intervene. "When I heard about Mr. Vance's bet, I didn't think about the money," the translation continued. "I thought I could finally help that horse that I had seen suffer so much." The crowd was in absolute silence. Even Howard's lawyers seemed touched by the story. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Lucy made some additional gestures, and the interpreter hesitated before translating. "She says she has something more to reveal, something she discovered in the last few days." Lucy pointed to Howard and made a series of complex signs. The interpreter became visibly confused, asking her to repeat several times. She says she recognizes Mr. Vance, that he was at Colonel Harrison's farm on the day Storm was more severely injured. The impact of the statement was immediate. Howard stood up abruptly, his face completely pale. "That's impossible. I never—" "She says you were there on the day they used fireworks near the horses to test them. Storm was so terrified that he injured himself trying to escape. You laughed and said you wanted to buy exactly that horse because he would be an interesting challenge." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind in the trees. Howard looked around, seeing the expressions of shock and disapproval on all the faces present. I was just— It was a business." His voice completely failed. Judge Ortega stood up, his expression grave. "Mr. Vance, do you confirm that you were present during the episodes of mistreatment described by the minor?" Howard looked at his lawyers, who made desperate signs for him not to answer. But something in Lucy's look, not accusatory, but simply sad, completely broke him. "I was there," he finally admitted, his voice almost inaudible. "I saw what they did to the horses, and I thought it would be fun to have a horse that no one could tame." The confession was followed by a deafening silence. Repsor Parker shook his head in disapproval. Charlie looked at the ground. Even Howard's lawyers seemed embarrassed. "Your Honor," said Paul Henry, "in light of this confession, we renew our request that the custody of the animal be transferred to people capable of caring for his physical and emotional well-being." Judge Puy. Ortega reflected for long minutes before giving his decision. "Considering all the evidence presented, including the defendant's confession, I declare that the horse known as Storm will be removed from the custody of Mr. Howard Vance. Temporary custody will be granted to Mr. Joseph Williams under supervision of the competent authorities until a permanent home suitable to the special needs of the animal is found." The crowd exploded in applause. Lucy didn't show euphoria, just a small and serene smile, as if she knew that justice always ends up prevailing. But the judge hadn't finished yet. "Additionally, I determine that a police inquiry be opened into the activities of Colonel Harrison and all those involved in the mistreatment documented in this process. And Mr. Vance will be fined $50,000, exactly the amount of his bet, which will be allocated to animal protection programs in the region." When everything was over and the crowd began to disperse, Howard approached Lucy. She looked at him without fear, only with that serenity that had already disarmed so many people. I'm sorry," he said, his voice broken. "I never wanted—" Lucy made some signs with her hands. The interpreter translated, "She says she forgives you, and that she hopes you learn to see animals as beings that can suffer, not as objects of entertainment." Tears ran down the face of the man who for months had considered himself superior to everyone around him. 3 months later, Lucy and Storm lived on a small property that Joseph had managed to buy with the help of donations from the community. The horse, under proper veterinary care and behavioral therapy, was gradually recovering from his traumas. Lucy had enrolled in the local school and was learning to read and write with the help of specialized teachers. But every afternoon, she still spent hours with Storm in a silent communion that had become a symbol of hope for the entire region. Howard had sold a large part of his lands and moved to the capital. Before leaving, however, he made a substantial donation for the creation of a rehabilitation center for traumatized animals, the first in the region. And so, what had begun as a vanity bet was transformed into a lesson of humility, compassion, and redemption. Lucy, the small deaf girl whom no one expected, had proved that sometimes the greatest strength in the world is simply the ability to understand the suffering of others and offer the rare gift of peace through silence. Storm was never ridden by anyone again. But every afternoon when Lucy sat beside him, he found something much more valuable than taming. He found the freedom to simply be loved and understood.